Welcome back to the podcast Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 179. Let's talk about heaven. And on the podcast today, I want to pick up kind of where we left off from the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' teachings about the kingdom of heaven and all of the many weeks and months we spent in the Sermon on the Mount. I want to actually shift a little bit and address some of how Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount impacts our understanding of heaven. And I have several reasons for wanting to talk about this now, and I will share those with you in the episode itself. But I really just want to talk about heaven. And there's a lot of conversation about this, it seems, all of the time. But I want us to look at what the Bible actually says about it. And then I'd like to use several resources that have been meaningful in my own life as I've tried to wrap my mind and heart around the concept, where it came from, how we think about heaven, and how we understand its relationship to the earth. And so I don't have this entirely outlined in my mind. I want to sort of do an introduction to it today. And then over the next several weeks, we'll look at various aspects of the way Christians oftentimes think about this reality and how Jesus speaks about it, and ultimately how Revelation brings us to understanding the direction that believers are headed and that heaven is headed in the end. And I hope that it will help to not only challenge you, but also strengthen your faith and give you a little more clarity about things that are oftentimes fuzzy. And I think they're fuzzy because we've imposed some ideas on the Bible that the Bible itself doesn't really understand. And so, without any more of an introduction, let's just get right into it. As I have been thinking about what to do next on the podcast, I had actually recently purchased a book by Skye Jethani, and you've heard me reference Skye's name before, particularly as it relates to a book he wrote called What If Jesus Was Serious? It's a visual guide to the teachings of Jesus we love to ignore, and it was Skye's version of a quick flyby and some in-depth look as well at the Sermon on the Mount. And Skye has actually written several other books. He wrote one called What If Jesus Was Serious About Prayer? What If Jesus Was Serious About the Church? And What If Jesus Was Serious About Heaven? And it was this most recent one, What If Jesus Was Serious About Heaven? A visual guide to experiencing God's kingdom among us, that I went out and picked up. And as I began to read it, and I listened to an interview he did on a podcast about his book, and things started to click for me. And I thought, okay, this might be a good topic for us to talk about. I've used Skye's book before in helping me lead you through the Sermon on the Mount. Why not use Skye's book again to introduce us to this idea of heaven and what Skye has to say in the book? But ultimately, several things began to come together in my mind. I've taught through looking at the beginning chapters in Genesis, and I've shared different books and resources that I think are helpful. And so I've actually come up with a list of a few books, a few resources, things that have challenged me over the years that have begun to shape the way that I think. And I'd like to just recommend those to you. I do apologize. Something has gone wrong from my end, at least as I perceive it. I'm not highly technical and computer savvy, but I generally know my way around a computer and how to navigate the internet and things like hyperlinks and things like that. But I have not been able to figure out how to embed a hyperlink onto my podcast show notes. And I have tried, I have emailed the company, I have done exactly the steps that they tell me to go through. And for some reason, when I go to publish it, they're not real links. And so I'll just name the books for you. I might rename them again in the podcast, but I do wish I was able to make links, but I don't know how to do that. The only reason I'm bringing this up is because a few of the resources are in fact YouTube videos, which I would highly encourage you to watch. But regardless, Skye's book is the first one I would recommend. What If Jesus Was Serious About Heaven? A visual guide to experiencing God's kingdom among us. The second one actually isn't about heaven. as so much as it's dealing with hell. And it's actually a book by Joshua Ryan Butler called The Skeletons in God's Closet: The Mercy of Hell, The Surprise of Judgment, and the Hope of Holy War. And I actually had Joshua on the podcast several years ago to talk about his book. And then I put forward that by the book conversation into a Throwback Thursday episode, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 months ago, something like that. So it's on the podcast a couple of times, but the first third of his book deals with the mercy of hell. And that's not oftentimes how we think about hell. We don't think about it as a merciful teaching. We think about it as a judgment and as a harsh reality. And Joshua does a fantastic job of taking us through the Bible's story and the way it speaks about the realities of heaven and hell, and oftentimes upending the way we normally internalize these things. And I connected with Joshua's book instantly, and for the most part, still think that he is right on the money. And so I definitely want to share that one with you as one that if you want some reading over this holiday season, it will challenge you. But Joshua is a very gracious, he writes like a pastor, which is what he is, but you will be able to follow some very complicated teaching, which oftentimes can be complicated when you're dealing with these kinds of issues, but he presents it in a way that is very easy to follow and very easy to understand, and I'm super grateful to him for that. One that's a little more theological and technical as far as Greek and Hebrew terms and things like that, but is a fantastic book to read. It is called The Temple and the Church's Mission: A Biblical Theology of the Dwelling Place of God. And this book is written by G.K. Beale, who is an outstanding Old Testament scholar. And in this particular book, Beale starts in the end of Revelation, and then he goes all the way back to the beginning of Genesis and shows how the dwelling place of God, i.e. through the temple, are images that are captured as early as the Garden of Eden, then brought into reality in the tabernacle of Israel, and then into their own temple, and then how Jesus embodies the dwelling place of God as the temple in John 2, John 1 and John 2, and then how Paul calls the church itself the temple of the living God. So Beale is going to trace the idea of how God dwells with people and how that oftentimes takes place in the temple. And he's going to show how the entire biblical story is just unfolding that reality in more and more detail. This, to date, is the only technical or overly theological work I've ever read that has literally brought me to tears. So that's not necessarily what it will do to you. I'm fairly an emotional person at times, and when I get really riveted by something, it will oftentimes evoke tears. And I've read the book twice. It's pretty thick. It's 400 to 500 pages. But if you want to chew on something meaty and you want to be ushered into the presence of God while doing it, I would encourage you to read that book. The last resource that I've used that I think is super helpful when talking about this topic is Tim Mackie and the Bible Project. And there's a short video on YouTube that you can find if you simply type in Bible Project Heaven and Earth. And it'll pop up something like, heaven and earth coming together, or how are they connected, or something of that effect. It's got several million views. It came out about 9 years ago. It's a 5 to 6 minute video with illustrations, which are great for those of us who maybe lack some long attention spans. But in that short video, it will really help to clarify some misunderstandings and just to bring this into an understanding that makes this crystal clear. Tim also then took that same video and has several times where he's preaching in different churches. He's been invited to preach in a church where he basically is teaching the same concept, and he uses it's like a clear board with colored markers, and he kind of draws some pictures showing us the normal narrative that a lot of people think Christians believe. and then what the Bible's narrative is on the same topic. And so if you type in Tim Mackie sermon, heaven and earth, or something like that, or heaven and hell, he oftentimes talks about that as well. It should pop up and you'll hear him. It's kind of he's on a stage with like I said, a clear, it's not a whiteboard, it's a clear board, but it looks like that, sort of on a pedestal there behind him, and he's drawing some things on it, and it's about a 45-minute sermon, but the main thrust of what he's getting at is about the last half hour of that. So if you want to take the time to read any of those books, listen to those, that is always in my mind as I'm talking. And so sometimes people have asked, hey, what are the books you would recommend? Well, those would be some starting points. Again, I always pick up extra themes. C.S. Lewis gets into some of this idea in his book, The Great Divorce, some things that Joshua Butler picked up on when he wrote his book, The Skeletons in God's Closet. And so what you'll find when you read a lot or listen to men who talk, or women who are perceptive and write great articles and books and things like that, is that they'll start to interact with each other. And it's really fun to go back and read those original sources, and then also read someone who's able to take potentially complicated ideas and bring them into the present in a way that's easy to understand. So in my own church, I'm actually preaching through the book of Revelation. And I may have mentioned this already, but on the podcast, if you're new to the podcast, I in fact did teach through the whole book of Revelation. Somewhere in 2019 through 2021, it seemed. I mean, it took me a couple of years to do it. I inserted some sermons. We had some by the book episodes. I talked to an author on his book on Revelation, which was an outstanding conversation. But as I'm teaching through the book now, I'm always learning, right? And I hope that that's the same for you. And some of you are Bible study teachers in your church or Sunday school leaders. And I hope that even if you teach the same material more than once, that you're constantly learning. And that would be my encouragement for you, would be to keep learning. But as I'm preaching through this, questions of the rapture are surfacing in my church, as well as general misunderstanding about the relationship between heaven and earth, expressed, I think, most succinctly, whether it's members of my church or whether it's members of any church, but expressed most succinctly in the earth now, heaven later idea. And I think Joshua Ryan Butler picks up on this. I know Tim Mackie speaks about this, and said I've not made this language up. This is just a helpful way to frame it. We're on the earth now. Heaven is a reality we will experience later. Now, I personally am not entirely sure where this belief came from, but when we approach the Bible believing this is what the Bible teaches, then we find it hard to make sense of much of what the Bible is actually saying. And so I just wanted to bring that up, right here at the beginning. So, for example, we have no categories at all to properly understand Jesus when he says that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, right? So he declares that it has come near, the kingdom of heaven has come near, and even that it is actually here in him. Now, for us reading the Bible, Jesus spoke 2,000 years ago. So that's a past tense reality. Although when we read about what is happening, Jesus is speaking in the present to his, to the crowds, to his disciples, to the Pharisees, to whoever happened to be listening. Jesus did not speak as if it is earth now, heaven later. Jesus spoke as if it was earth now, heaven now. And that's a new idea. And I hope that it's, it sinks in for you. But that's why I'm saying if we come up with these ideas and we impose them into the Bible, then it doesn't make much sense of what the Bible is actually saying. So as I shared already, I've taught on this topic throughout the podcast. I talked about it at different points in Revelation. I had whole episodes on this, and I might go back and review some of those notes. But if you go all the way back even to the first several episodes on the podcast, where I walked through how the Garden of Eden itself was the first temple, and how in that temple, heaven and earth were united. which is what all subsequent temples are trying to emulate, right? The temples are built on the tops of mountains because people believed that the mountaintops were the closest physical spaces to the heavens. Therefore, you were the closest you could be to the gods who lived in the heavens when you went to one of these temples. So we're bringing a little bit of our ancient Near Eastern ideas, and this transcends the Christian religion, right, or the Jewish religion. Like this is almost all religions. So according to the Bible, before the fall, heaven and earth were united in the Garden of Eden, the world's first temple. And the image of the God who had recently conquered and subdued the vast chaos that was earth was set up in his temple. And that image was mankind himself. Again, I have several episodes. I believe they are episodes number 10, number 11, and number 12 on the podcast, which do take us all the way back to the fall of 2018. But I don't think that they are dated episodes. In fact, I think they would be highly relevant for you today. But the rest of the biblical story then, so I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So, it says, as I shared in those episodes, it was for this reason that man was forbidden to worship images of God, i.e. an idol, because they themselves were the image. And I have a whole episode on that too in episode number 5. So this uniting of heaven and earth, right, God's space and man's space overlapping, this period of time when God's space and man's space overlapped, which took place in the Garden of Eden, is how the biblical story begins. When mankind sins, we are introduced to a chasm now between these two spaces. In our own sinfulness, we ripped these spaces apart, in a sense, and destroyed the oneness that man and God had in their relationship. So the rest of the biblical story is how God is going to reunite heaven and earth once again. Now, sadly, in many, many circles of evangelical Christianity, there seems to be no understanding of this reality at all. Like, this seems to be like some cute little extra little piece of bonus trivia or something like that, if you can happen to remember this. But at the very least, this was true of my upbringing, right? I didn't have any idea that this was true. And nearly all the feedback that I've received from those first few episodes that I published on the temple from this podcast came from listeners who had never heard of these concepts before either. Now, I assume the majority of the listeners to this podcast are church-going people, and that has proven to be true for the most part, at least of those that I'm aware of who are listening to the podcast. And when people listen to this teaching, they say, wow, I never knew that. Now, here's the thing, right? If we don't know the beginning of the story, and therefore we don't know what the rest of the story is trying to bring us back to, then how in the world are we going to have the right idea of what restoration in this world is supposed to look like? So really, we really shouldn't be all that surprised that if we don't know how the Bible story begins, and we don't start with the imagery and concepts that the Bible frames reality with, then of course we are going to come up with distorted views about the direction we think redemption is headed. And one of the most distorted views we've adopted is this idea that we are going to escape this place called earth and enter into some disembodied heaven when we die. Now, for some, everything they've staked their lives on depends on that view being real. They want to know that their deceased loved ones are enjoying peace right now. They want to know that at some point all the pain and heartache and injustice and unrest present in this world will come to an end. And so when they hear me say that one of the most distorted views we've adopted is the idea that we are going to escape this place called earth and enter into some disembodied heaven after we die, they panic. And they panic because to many people, belief in a heaven we escape to is not only where they've placed their hope, but it's what many of them have come to believe is the point of it all. Jesus came to save us from our sins so that we could go to heaven when we die. Sound familiar? Now, before discouragement sets in, or frustration, or anger, or please, before you turn this off, please understand that despite the fact that I do not believe the Bible teaches what many people believe it teaches about heaven, does not mean that I don't think that peace is what will be offered to deceased loved ones. I too want to know that at some point all the pain and heartache and injustice and unrest present in this world will come to an end. Hear me. Jesus wants this even more than we do, and he will decisively deal with all of it. But I'd like us to allow Jesus to deal with it the way he says he will, not by inserting our own views of heaven and then imagining that is what Jesus is talking about. As I said at the beginning, this is just an introduction. I'm not dealing with a whole lot of things at first, but I'm going to think through over the next several weeks the best way to walk us through this concept. And it might involve a little bit of a going back to the beginning to listen to the way the Bible tells its own story. But it's also going to go toward the very end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, where we see directionally, or we see the direction, is it people from the earth going to heaven, or is it heaven coming to the earth? How we get this right in our minds shapes the way we treat this earth and the people in it. It also frames the way we think about things like judgment and discipline and salvation and redemption. And I honestly think that it would reshape the way we think about the way we treat other people and how we expect to be treated ourselves. And so I'm excited for this. I wanted to offer you some resources, again, so that you can study along with me, but you can go out and pick up one of these resources, and they're going to be far more beneficial for you than anything that I'm going to say on this podcast. I am just compiling some of the great thoughts that I've read over the years, and I'm going to bring them to you. We're going to use the Bible. We're going to look at what it actually says about heaven and earth and probably hell, but we'll start with heaven, because I think we get this idea in our minds, and I'll leave you with this, right? We sometimes, in the narrative we offer, make this idea earth now, heaven and hell later. And we have this idea that heaven and hell are these counterparts. Those are two destinations that people are going to go to when they die. And in the narrative that we have typically grown comfortable with, the heaven and hell seem to be the endpoints or the goals, right, of what takes place after things shake out on the earth. And then heaven and hell become these twin parts of this destination point. But when the Bible speaks about these realities, it does not put heaven and hell in a partnership of some kind, speaking about the two alternatives that you could face at the end of your life. Rather, the partnership that the Bible uses when speaking about these realities is heaven and earth, not heaven and hell. And Joshua Ryan Butler was really helpful in one of the opening chapters of his book. Simply says, go do a Google search or go to a BibleGateway.com where you can search the scriptures and type in the words heaven and hell and look for how many verses show up that speaks about those two realities in the same verse. And while you're listening to me, if you have never yet done that, I would encourage you to do it. If you're at your computer doing some work and you're accessible to the internet, go ahead and do that right now. If you're not accessible, or you would like to just take a guess how many verses in the Bible talk about heaven and hell in the same context, what would you assume that would be? Do you assume it would be 50, 150? 550, the way we speak about it in our own context, you would think that the Bible is filled with these kinds of references. Well, if you've had the chance to Google this, or you have read Joshua's book before and know the answer to this question, or you've listened to me talk about this and know the answer to the question, you would know that the number of times the Bible speaks together in the same context, the words or the ideas of heaven and hell, you would get a big fat 0. That's right. Not once in the entire Bible are the ideas of heaven and hell spoken about in the same context. Because that's a framework that we have. That's not a framework that the Bible operates under. The partnership that the Bible operates under when it speaks about heaven, the counterpart to heaven is not hell. The counterpart to heaven is earth. And if you type into a Google search, heaven and earth, you're going to get several hundred hits, because this is something that is spoken about a lot more. Actually, to be honest, I don't remember how many hits you'll get. So if you Google that and we only get 60, then don't call me a liar. I might be speaking out of ignorance, but the idea is, in the beginning, God created what? The heavens and the earth. Notice, and we might take some time to look through this, there is no mention of hell in the beginning. And we may get into an explanation as we go as to why. I do think today that there is a lot of conversation, and I have thought for a long time about how to speak about the realities of hell in a way where those who are very committed to a particular comfortable narrative won't try to drive me out by calling me a heretic. And I do think it might be easier for us all if we start with heaven and its relationship to the earth, and then to start to figure out where this idea of hell comes from and how it has worked its way in, not only to our narrative, but much worse, into our actual world, and what God in Jesus is going to do about it. So that is really what I want us to do. I want us to read the Bible the way the Bible presents reality. I want us to adopt that view of reality, and then I want us to allow that view of reality to shape our views and our narratives. And I think when we do that, we're going to see aspects of the character of God that will blow us away in great and wonderful and amazing ways. And we're going to have to relinquish some of the grip that we have about what we think is supposed to happen after people die. And I think Jesus is going to be the most helpful for us in taking a look at this. And I'm simply excited to explore it with you. So that's all the time that we're going to take for this week. I just wanted to kind of whet your appetite for this. I've kind of wanted to offer a little bit of an introduction. Even as I'm talking, I'm getting more ideas about things that we'll have to look into as we go. And some of this may be refreshing to you. Some of it might make you uneasy, but you don't need to worry about this. Jesus is going to lead us and guide us and direct us. And any teaching that is coming from him is far more liberating and far more freeing than anything we can come up with on our own. So we'll let the Bible do it for us. We'll let it direct us and change us and challenge us and strengthen us. And we will be better Christians for it. So again, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm looking forward to studying this with you. And as always, feel free to ask me questions, send me comments, any kind of feedback that you have. I welcome that as a review on whatever podcast app you choose to listen to these episodes. I also welcome that in email form. If you want to email me at unbindingthebible@gmail.com, I'd be happy to interact with you. And hopefully you're doing well and are enjoying your season of Advent as we anticipate the coming of Jesus. So thanks so much for tuning in. Have a great week, and I will talk to you next time.